Welcome to Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. Here we explore the training and development of America's leaders in the application of air power and the profession of arms. The views expressed are those of the hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Welcome back to another episode of Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. I am Colin Slade.
And I'm Reed Gann, and we're your hosts for Commission Ed. So, Colin, this week we're going to be playing our third interview of a rated pilot. Pretty excited about that.
Look at us go.
I know, right? Planes and stuff. Yeah, awesome. Air power. There you go. So this week we have Lt Morgan Curriden, Lt Morgan No Call Sign Curriden. I'm sure that'll be resolved here shortly.
Yeah, I'm anxious to find out what call sign he's going to earn because of this podcast interview.
I feel like he won't like it, but we'll see. Yeah, so really great episode, great interview. Really looking forward to sharing it with you folks. So what Morgan's going to be talking about today is a lot about the ROTC experience, talk about how to get a pilot slot out of ROTC, talk a little bit about UPT. He'll go in depth about how that experience works, and then all the way leading up to finally the selection for your platform or drop night. Really good rundown of that process. To those who are outside the community, it's kind of a black box. You know, you think all Air Force people are pilots and all of them drive fighter aircraft. And he really breaks down kind of some tools and tips for success in all those areas.
Yeah. The one thing that I want to add to that is that this interview happened in immediate succession after last week's episode with Slider. And because it was in that format, I didn't go into depth with Morgan about being an F-15 pilot because we just did that with Slider. And so I wanted this episode specifically to focus on UPT, and I think Morgan just knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's pretty fresh from that experience, so I think it's really good to get somebody who just left that. So that was really good.
Yeah. So with that, let's turn it over to Morgan No Call Sign Curriden. Welcome back to another episode of Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. I am Colin Slade, and today I am joined by
Lt Morgan Curriden.
Lt Morgan Curriden. Just Morgan? You haven't earned the right to a call sign yet?
Not yet. That's a rite of passage in our community, and I haven't proved myself yet.
You haven't proved yourself, or you haven't done anything stupid enough to earn it?
I mean, proved myself is definitely the nice way to say it. Yeah. I'm sure there's a million anecdotes that you could use to give me a call sign at this point. Just hasn't happened yet. Not quite there.
If you had to choose one right now for yourself, I know obviously it doesn't work that way, but if you could choose, what would it be?
I know a lot of the instructors call me Johnny Bravo. My hair is I will say it's pushing the regs just a little bit. If you know what Air Force regs are, and that has been kind of a common thread throughout my Air Force career thus far, just kind of towing that line right down it. What can I say? I've always loved my full head of hair, and the Air Force loves it a little bit less than I do.
So you're right at the maximum 1.25 inch bulk. You're like, I'm going to go right up to that line.
If we want to call it 1.25 inches, let's call it 1.25 inches. Exactly. Yeah, I'm right there. It's where I live.
That's how you live just in general? You're a man that goes right to the edge and no further?
I mean, it always depends, but yeah, that's how I like to be. I mean, that's one of the great things about what I do is it kind of allows you to push the limits a little bit. And if that's something that you enjoy, then it's a dream come true.
All right. Well, that's awesome. We'll explore a little bit of that, but I'm going to make a suggestion to anybody that's out there that might be responsible for a call sign that you might receive. I don't know, Slider, if you're listening, maybe you should call this guy Edge.
Oh, man. I don't know.
I could get behind Bravo, too. I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, that sounds super tactical, right? I love it. There's actually already an instructor in my squadron called Edge, so I don't know. I might have to pay him for it or something. Yeah, I don't know how that works. If you got to steal a call sign, maybe there's a procedure for it. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
All right. Yeah, when you finally get your call sign for whatever reason, because you proved yourself or because you truly earned it,
One of the two.
One of the two. Let us know, and we'll be happy to
do a special
do a special one. Yep.
All right, I will do that. It should be pretty soon here.
All right. Well, for lack of a call sign, we'll just stick with Morgan. How about?
That sounds great.
All right, Morgan. Welcome to the show. We're excited to have you. I'm going to get out of your way and let you introduce yourself to our audience. Where you came from, what was your background, why you decided to pursue the Air Force, how you got in. Over to you, man.
All right, yeah. So I was born and raised in Las Vegas, Nevada. My whole family still lives out there. And, I mean, ever since I was a little kid, I kind of wanted to do the Air Force. I'd had family in Utah and siblings that went to BYU growing up. And for those of you that have driven on the I-15 from Las Vegas to Utah, it goes right by Nellis Air Force Base. And the jets out there just love to buzz the freeway. Every time I passed by the base there, I'd see something taking off or landing there and flying low over the freeway. And, I mean, when you're a kid and when you're a teenager, that just seems like the greatest thing in the world. And then the other thing is when I was a kid, the movie Independence Day was like one of my favorite movies ever. In fact, my family still watches it every year on July 4th, mostly because I make them. But, I mean, I just absolutely love that movie. And some of the flying footage in that movie is ultimately, when I was a kid, what made me decide that I wanted to do Air Force. And I was a little bit devastated to learn later on that they were actually Marines in Independence Day. But in my book, it was all the same. I just wanted to go fly fighters. And so in the process of that, I ended up going to school at BYU and doing ROTC there in order to get my commission into the Air Force. I majored in Arabic while I was there. Just figured it'd be a good fallback just in case the pilot thing didn't work out. It hasn't really come up at all in my career, to be honest, but it was a really good experience. I loved BYU. I still love BYU. Go Cougs. But it was definitely an interesting experience to be there and have kind of one hat that was the college student hat and the other hat that was the Air Force officer in training. That was a really good experience for me, and I loved ROTC. I loved the time that I spent there. Ended up commissioning with a pilot slot. Went to NATO jet pilot training down in Shepherd Air Force Base and dropped F-15Es out of that program, and I've been doing that for about 6 or 7 months now. And it's been an absolute dream come true for me. I mean, I've loved every second of it. I've got no regrets, and yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that experience and how amazing it's been over the years.
Good. Yeah, we're excited to have you on the show, fresh, essentially off of UPT.
Yeah. Yep. Just a couple of months ago.
Good. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. But before we dive into UPT, let's talk a little bit more about your ROTC experience.
Sure. Yeah.
What were some of the things that you truly enjoyed? What were some of the things that you truly hated? If you were the king for a day, what might you change? What might you keep in place? Share some of your thoughts about that commissioning process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, right off the bat, I loved all the friends that I made there. I mean, my core group of friends was really the dudes that I met and worked with in ROTC. And those guys are still my friends. You know, I still talk to them every single day and keep up with what they're doing in their careers. And so that was amazing, just having that core group. You know, I can't speak to all ROTC detachments, but I think BYU, Det 855, did a really good job of building leaders, of building responsible leaders, of teaching you what it's like to have people under you that you are responsible for. And that's a little bit ironic. I mean, I'm sure as we'll talk later on, because that doesn't really happen for a while when you're a pilot. But at least for that time, I felt like ROTC did a good job of teaching you how to handle responsibility, specifically responsibility for people. So saying, for example, we want this outcome out of this group of individuals, and we're going to hold you as a person responsible for that outcome. Even though you yourself can't accomplish it by yourself, it's going to be a collective effort. We're going to hold you as an individual responsible for the success of that group. And I think that was something that was actually taught very well in ROTC. I was very impressed with the cadre that I had while we were there and the upperclassmen that we had, and I thought they did an amazing job. And frankly, you know, I still think about, you know, being an officer more like them. Specifically, I can remember my commander, Colonel Kacharik, while I was there, was always just an amazing example to me of just being like above reproach, of at any given time feeling like he had the absolute respect of anybody in the organization. And so that's still a really, really great, I guess, standard to me of who to be and what to be as an Air Force officer. So all that was really, really awesome. In terms of things that I would change, I mean, PT at 5 a.m, that got pretty old after a while, but I recognize the benefit. Absolutely. I recognize that there were things that taught me in and of itself, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That really sucked at times. Going to bed at 2 a.m. and setting your alarm and being like, oh man, I literally only have 3 hours before I've got to wake up and go to PT. I think if I were king for a day and I had obviously unlimited funds, because that's always what it comes down to,
Sure,
I would probably change field training quite a bit. Field training, I'm sure most people know is kind of like the ROTC basic training, quote unquote, and it has, for funding reasons, been progressively scaled back over the last couple of years to the point where, and you could probably speak to this, Cap Slade, but now it's something like 14 days and very, very easy. And I can tell you that I had a good experience there, but I also have gotten to know prior enlisted people since commissioning and also before commissioning that have told me about their experiences in actual Air Force basic training. And I feel like as officers, we just really can't relate to that because we don't get any of the same training that they get. In fact, just the other day, I was talking to one of the Wizzos in my squadron who is a prior enlisted ammunitions guy with 810s. And he talks about just how bad officers can be at very basic things like saluting. Like officers that go through OTS never really learn how to salute. And that's something that's drilled into enlisted guys through basic training. And so I think even little things like that, I wish field training could be a little bit longer and a little bit tougher to give officers a little bit more of a taste of what enlisted guys go through, because especially guys that graduate and do maintenance or logistics or acquisitions, I mean, right out of the gates, their first assignment, they're going to have dozens of airmen that they are directly responsible for. And they don't really have any bearing on what those airmen have been through if they're not prior enlisted. So I wish that field training helped out with a little bit of that, and then maybe, ROTC in general. And I understand, the rationales behind the changes that have been made. Some of them have been funding related, and some of them have been related to, just changes in culture. And obviously those are for the best, and the reasons behind those changes are what they are. But I certainly wish there were things that we could do that could allow us as officers to relate a little bit more to what the enlisted people go through, because they're ultimately the backbone of what we do in the Air Force. They're 80% of everybody in the Air Force, and I feel like as officers we can't always relate to their situation and what they've been through.
Yeah, so let's explore that just a little bit more. Let's say you have unlimited funding. Obviously that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
But let's say you have unlimited funds. You have unlimited access to facilities and all the support elements needed to do what you want to do. What would you then do to address some of those issues to make sure that our officers, regardless of commissioning source, have those fundamental basics in place so that they can better relate to the enlisted, so that they can be better leaders in those various different positions, especially those ones where they are directly responsible for the enlisted, such as security forces, maintenance, logistics, engineering. But even in a pilot type situation or rated air crew where you're not going to be directly supervising those enlisted airmen for at least 8, 10, 12 years or something like that, what would you do?
Yeah, I would maybe take a portion of that field training and try to make it a little bit more similar to normal Air Force basic training, just to give us an idea of what exactly they go through. That would be my first point. And I guess my second point would be, I wish that somebody would ask them, somebody would ask the enlisted guys, what do you wish your officers knew? What do you wish your officers were more trained on? Because I think you'd find if you did that there are probably a lot of themes, probably a lot of things that a lot of enlisted people say that they wish their officers were more adept at or more trained at. Because, my experience has been very limited in terms of leadership of enlisted people. The things that I know are mostly from the people that I interact with that were prior enlisted and are now officers, that talk about just what a different world it is and how hard it is for officers to relate to that world. Because there's a surprising number that I've met in my community that have become pilots or WIZOs that were prior crew chiefs or maintainers or ammunitions guys. And it's mostly been through talking with them that I've gotten that insight.
Sure, that's fair. And I don't claim to be an expert on the enlisted perspective either. Never was enlisted. Kind of wish that I was.
Yeah, I feel the same way sometimes.
So I would have that experience, that perspective, that ability to draw on that knowledge and be a better leader for them. And neither are you the expert either. And both of us are talking around this issue that truly we don't really know anything about. But what we're hitting on is that we both recognize that there are some gaps in our officer sessions that need to be addressed, albeit recognizing that there are some limitations on what we can do because of funding or various statutes, regulations, or things like that. It's something that we've talked about a lot on this podcast and that we will continue to address.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Just how can we, as a whole, ROTC, OTS, and the Academy, and then really expanding that to the broader Department of Defense, how can we produce better officers who then are better leaders for the airmen and ultimately produce better outcomes for the Air Force and the Department of Defense?
Right, because that's the goal of all three of those programs. Exactly.
Yep. So just something that we wanted to touch on because it's an important topic and something that we address on this podcast regularly.
Yeah, I bet. For sure.
Well, cool. You mentioned that through ROTC you made a lot of friends.
Yeah.
And they remain your friends to this day. What is it about ROTC and the experiences that you went through with those people that enabled you to build those friendships, forge those bonds, and make them last even till today, even though probably you're not stationed with a lot of them?
No. I mean, we're all over the place. I got a friend in Turkey. I got a friend in Offutt, another friend down in Florida. Yeah, I mean, I think it was just doing hard things together, and we kind of just learned to embrace that. We'd get to the point where we would, all wake up super early and like call each other to make sure we were all awake and drive to PT together in the morning and drive back together. And, if there were like competitions we did, I don't know if you guys still do the GAFB, but we all drove down to do the GAFB in Las Vegas one year.
What's the GAFB for those that don't know?
German Armed Forces Proficiency Badge. So there's like a bunch of different athletic events like relays, rucks, swimming, sprint races, that kind of thing. And you get a gold, silver, or bronze at the end, depending on how you performed in those. But like we did that one year and got all pumped up for it and trained for it and rucked together. And I think so it's just like doing those hard things together as a core group that has kept us close throughout the years. And then it's been interesting to track their experience compared to mine, because each one of us has had really, really different experiences since joining the Air Force from each other. So it's always interesting to come back and we'll all still, we've got a group chat that we keep pretty active, and then we'll all Skype together every once in a while. And it's been really interesting to track all their experiences in the Air Force and see the different experiences that they've had.
Yeah. So clearly you as a pilot are going to have a different experience from someone who joins the Air Force and instantly comes into a support role, is like, security forces or civil engineering, very different training pipelines. What are some of the things that your buddies are doing, and what are the differences that you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the biggest difference is just that the guys that didn't do flying related jobs are getting a lot more leadership opportunities than we are. So I've got one friend that's doing cyber and one friend that's doing security forces, and both of them right off the bat were flight commanders as second lieutenants, writing bullets for their airmen and getting guys out of DUIs or whatever. They're essentially responsible for those airmen. And I think that's probably the biggest difference in terms of their experience versus mine. Because my experience as an officer thus far has been learn your job and learn how to do it well. Learn how to operate essentially a piece of machinery the best you can without a whole lot of human interaction. Whereas for them, it's been kind of flipped. There is a technical aspect of it. Obviously, my buddy who does security forces has to learn how to operate weapons and drive Humvees and that kind of thing. And my friend that's a cyber guy has to learn aspects of that. But the emphasis for both of them is managing people. So I think that's probably the biggest difference in our experience. But I think they've also had really, really good experiences, just in different ways.
Yeah. Well, so let's just talk about your experience. Knowing that they've been doing that traditional human relations, leadership, and team building type stuff, where you have been focused on the technical, becoming a technician on your airframe. How do you feel about that? Do you feel like you're missing out? Are you okay with it? What's been your thought process?
I think my thought process primarily has been that ROTC was really designed for those people, the people that get in and become leaders. And I think that is a good thing, because there's only so much that you can do to prepare to go to pilot training. But all of the training that we got in ROTC, I think, was specifically geared towards their job, the job of leading people. And I mean, I'm not disappointed that I don't have those opportunities, because I think it was, clear from the start when I was learning about my job that was going to be the case. But it is interesting to look back and say that all that training is geared towards being a leader to airmen and being that second lieutenant flight commander on day one, writing bullet points and performance reviews. So it's interesting. I mean, I think the most important thing would be to just, if you are interested in being an officer in the Air Force, to find out what exactly that looks like in your mind, being an officer, and then picking the job that fits that what you want it to be. If what you want is to be a leader, then probably don't go for a pilot slot or a CISO slot. And if what you really want is just to fly and you don't really care for leading airmen, then probably don't go into maintenance or don't go into security forces. So I think, they're both different. They're both rewarding. I think the important thing is just before you commission, knowing what those careers are going to look like and making sure that you end up in one that matches what you want for yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've talked about on this podcast before, and will continue to do so, is that you as an individual and as an officer get to define for yourself what success looks like.
Absolutely. Yep.
That for some person, for one person, that may look like the traditional leadership role where you are assigned a group of people and you are their manager, you are their leader, you provide that strategic and tactical vision for them on a day-to-day basis. But for others, such as yourself, success looks different. It's not neither right nor wrong. It is just different in that you're still a leader. It's just a different type of leadership. You may be a leader of one, being first and foremost responsible for yourself and being technically proficient in the role that the Air Force has assigned you, as well as being responsible for being a leader in a role where you do not have direct authority over another individual. So, for example, you're flying the F-15. You've got a Wizzo there in another cockpit with you, and you may be the lieutenant pilot with a captain or a major Wizzo, and there is still some leadership dynamics going on there. You are ultimately responsible for the operation of that aircraft. The leadership still exists. It's a different type, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think in that sense, the leadership comes down to trusting each other. And I'm sure that's the case with any crewed aircraft, but the roles that we have in the F-15 between the front seater and the back seater, the pilot and the Wizzo, are very different. They're very unique. And, the Wizzo can't do my job, and I certainly can't do his job. And so there has to be that level of trust between us that he is going to do his job well, and that he's going to target the bombs well and input the coordinates well, and not mess up when he's talking to the JTAC, and he has to trust me that I can, land the airplane and I can employ the airplane and put it where it needs to be when it needs to be there. So I think the leadership in that sense in the cockpit of the F-15 comes down to trusting each other to be able to do our jobs well. And if you don't have that trust, then the whole mission crumbles. If you're second guessing what the guy in your backseat is doing every step of the way, or if he's second guessing what you're doing, then the success of the mission ultimately crumbles, because you're not as lethal as if you just trust that he's going to do what he needs to do. And I mean, obviously, I have very limited experience so far, just based on the amount of time that I have in the airframe. But in the little bit that I've seen, that's been just absolutely vital.
No, but you haven't had limited experience. Your whole time as a cadet, going then through NJEPT and now working through your B course for the F-15, you've been dealing with other people and building relationships and trying to build that trust with other people all along. So it's not that you have limited experience. Yes, you have limited experience in the F-15 specifically, but throughout your entire Air Force career since 2011, when you came into ROTC, so that's 9 years that we have been trying, and you have been trying to develop this capability of trusting other people and enabling them to trust you.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that doesn't just apply to my job either. I think every step of the way, you've got to have that trust. I think it's really easy to see that in action in the F-15 because we have a very easy mission to quantify, I guess. Does the bomb get to the right target? Does it hit the right building? Does it kill the right guy? But I think it applies to everything. It goes out to us being able to trust the guys that are flying our tankers, that they can be there on time, the enlisted guy that operates the boom, that he's going to be able to know how to do his job, even down to when I go and see the flight doc, I have to know that he's not going to mess up a prescription or tell me the wrong thing that I'm sick with. So I guess, in that sense, the cockpit of an F-15 is just kind of a microcosm of everything they teach you in ROTC, which is that no matter what your job you have to learn how to do it well in order for the Air Force to work. And we all have to trust each other that everyone knows how to do their job, even above and beyond just the ops world. So yeah. I mean, in that sense, I have seen a fair bit of that in my experience in the Air Force, just because I've interacted with all those people throughout the years.
Yeah. So just kind of bringing things full circle and summarizing this discussion we're having, there are many things that I think are wrong with ROTC, and I feel like you agree. But one of the things that I feel like we get right is that we teach our cadets and our future officers how to build relationships and initiate that process of building trust between us.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I can't speak for your experience, but I imagine that you are going to agree with me that I can be stationed anywhere and be assigned a responsibility to work with other officers, and my default is to trust that person.
Absolutely.
That I can feel confident that they are going to be proficient and capable in their job, and that they're going to get the mission done and support me, and I will support them without having to know anything about them. There's no interview process. There's no trying to figure out, hey, do we jive together? Do our personalities mesh? That's not what the Air Force is about. We, by default, trust the people that we have to work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if we don't, then things fall apart pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that happens on every level of the Air Force, from the security guy that checks your ID at the gate all the way up to if you are downrange and dropping bombs. I don't necessarily know the day before who's going to be flying in my back seat. It could be, any Wizzo in my squadron. But I have to be totally comfortable in my squadron that he's going to be able to know how to do his job. That when we get there and the crap hits the fan, that even though I don't know beforehand exactly who it's going to be, that he's going to know how to do his job. And I think that you're right, that extends to all of the officers, at least that I've met in the Air Force. And I think that in a way that is largely thanks to ROTC, because it prevents people that you wouldn't trust from getting into that position. from becoming officers. You hope so, certainly. There are people that get through the cracks, of course. But, I mean, even just speaking in the small microcosm of my graduating class, the people that I graduated with at BYU, I mean, every single one of those dudes are just awesome and huge assets to the Air Force in all the different things that they're doing. And I 100% trust them in what they're doing in their jobs right now. And I have BYU ROTC to thank for that.
Yeah. We have to put the caveat on this, though. Make no mistake, there are bad officers out there. And you will come in contact with them. And you, as hopefully the good officer, and I'm using the term you broadly, you, Morgan, me, Colin, our entire audience who is an officer or is hoping to become one, is hopefully going to be the good officer and needs to know how to deal with that bad officer when the occasion arises.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is something that everyone has to deal with in any program. You hope that everyone is there for the right reasons because they want to be there and that they are just as committed as you are, but the reality is that's not always going to be the case. And in terms of how to deal with them, I mean, I can only speak for my own community and for my experience, but I think that at least in the flying world, the squadron itself is only as strong as its weakest pilot or its weakest Wizzo. So yeah, everybody works together to try to bring that person up. If there's a member of your class that's struggling in something or maybe not studying as hard as they should, then you help them out. You study with them. You work on the weekends. You make flashcards for them, because ultimately their failure is the failure of everybody in your squadron. So I think that's probably the first thing, and then the second thing is I think just remembering the fact that it at the end of the day, we love to give out awards and ribbons and stuff as the Air Force, but the important thing is that the job gets done at the end of the day. So remembering that, if you're dealing with somebody that's not doing his job, the job has to get done. And so it's remembering that and just remembering the big picture of the mission is bigger than each individual person, and that making sure it gets done regardless of who does it is ultimately the most important thing.
No, it's absolutely true. And I'm glad you brought it to that conclusion that the Air Force and its mission is bigger and more important than any one of us.
Yeah, exactly. And we're all just parts trying to make it work. And if there's a part that's not working, then it's everyone's responsibility to try to work around it to make sure that the mission still gets accomplished.
Yep. Awesome. I love it. Well, good. Let's keep going in our discussion here. Let's get to the topic that I know everybody who's listening to this is wanting to hear about. Let's talk about UPT.
All right.
So, first of all, let's build up to it.
Okay.
So, quickly talk to your experience as a cadet applying for the rated board and getting selected to be a pilot. From there, the process of getting to UPT, going through IFS and the medical flight screening, and then we'll end up at day one of UPT.
Okay. So the very first thing that I did and that everyone has to do is figure out how to get a pilot slot. I mean, obviously that's step one to becoming a pilot, to putting on those wings, is figuring out how you can get a slot out of ROTC. I can't speak to OTS or the academy, but at least in ROTC, there are a couple of factors that they take into account when you're applying for a pilot slot. And from my experience, I tried to figure out what those factors were really early on and figured out how I could try to work that system to maximize those factors. So at least for me, it was GPA, PFA, commander's ranking, AFOQT score, which the AFOQT is kind of like the officer's standardized test, like the SAT for Air Force officers, and then how well you do at field training, which is like that officer basic training. So for me in college, it was just about kind of working my experience as a student and as a cadet in order to maximize those areas, those 5 areas. And
the numbers from the past year are public. At least they were when I went through. So you can get on and figure out what the average was, the average GPA, the average PFA, the average AFOQT score. And so I kind of just used those as like my goals. If the average, PFA score to get into pilot training was a 97, I wanted to get a 98. If the average GPA was a 3.5, I wanted to get a 3.6. And I think if anybody, for anybody that wants to get a pilot slot, that's a really good way to do it. Use those numbers, those averages as your goals for what you're trying to make like your baseline, your minimum.
Yeah, that makes sense. But keep in mind that is a moving target.
Yes,
and that
absolutely.
Year to year, those averages are going to go up or down. And so if one year it happens to be down and you aim to just barely beat those averages, the following year, the selection rate, the averages may be much, much higher, and you put yourself in a bind because you didn't make it as high as you probably could have.
It's a really good point. And so that's why I would say use those numbers as a baseline. So maybe saying that using them as a goal was the wrong way to put it, but use them as like, that is the baseline, the lowest that I would accept of myself. So there's that. And then the other thing is, of those numbers, you have kind of a varying amount of control over those. Obviously you can't pick your commander's ranking. You can do things to help it. You can be a good cadet and a good leader, but it's, your commander is going to rank how he's going to rank, and that is what it is. But you can control your GPA. You have 100% control over GPA. You have 100% control over the score that you get on your PFA. To a certain extent, you have a great amount of control on your AFOQT. You can take practice tests. You can really study hard for it. So I would say use those numbers as a baseline, as the absolute minimum, and then max out everything that you have 100% control over. So if you want a pilot slot, get 100 on the PFA. Have a 3.8, 3.9, 4.0 GPA, because those are things that you have complete control over. And I think you'll probably find that if you do that, the other things will benefit. Your commander will probably notice that if you have 100 on the PFA and you have a 4.0 GPA, and you'll probably end up doing better on the AFOQT. So that's in terms of getting a pilot slot. What you do in order to get a pilot slot, that definitely helped me. Once you have a pilot slot, the summer in between your junior and your senior year in ROTC, you go to flight screening. It was at Wright Pat back in the day. I think it probably still is. Yeah, and that, that's just kind of something that everybody has to go through. It really, really sucks. You're all in this big room, you're all wearing PT gear, and they're just pulling you out one by one to do medical tests. And everybody there, for the most part, has pilot slots, and they're all really excited about it. And typically in any group of guys, there's a certain number that get told that they're going to be disqualified for some reason. And a good amount of the time, it was something that they had no idea about. We had a guy in my group found out he had a tiny hole in his lung that he had never known about. He was a super fit guy, but that disqualified him. We had some guys that found out that, their eyes weren't good enough, even though they'd had 20/20 vision since they were, little kids. So that part sucks. And I guess you just have to be at peace with the fact that if it doesn't work out for that reason, that's the way it was supposed to happen. I personally am fairly religious, and I feel like, God has a plan for all of us. And so if you fail out because you were colorblind or because, you have a small heart problem, then that's just God's plan for you. And you know what? It's okay. It's not because you didn't work hard enough. It's not because you didn't make it there. That just is what it is. And for the friends that I had that happened to, that was the comfort that they were able to find, that it wasn't anything that they did wrong. So anyway, the majority of people do get through that, as stressful as it is. It's about a week-long process. You get to the end, you feel like you've run several marathons, but at that point it's over and you're like, all right, I'm good to go. I'm medically qualified to be a pilot. The next step is getting your base assignment. There's 3 UPT bases and 1 NATO pilot training base, which is NJUPT. You should get those base assignments around the fall. We got them in the fall of our senior years. And then at that point, I would say try to find out as much as you can about the base and get excited about it. Learn what's around, learn what people do around there, what the nightlife is like. Get excited to go there. Some of them are bigger than others. If you end up in Del Rio, you'll find it's It's a little more quiet than maybe if you end up at Columbus, but I've got friends in my current community that have been to all 4 bases, and there's good things about all of them. Even though it might not seem like it at first, there are definitely awesome experiences to be had at all 4 pilot training bases. So once you've done that, at that point, you're just kind of waiting to commission. You're keeping fit and making sure you don't fail your last PFA before you commission, and then you're off to the races. You commission and you go off to your base. You arrive at your base typically in ABUs, and it's kind of surreal the first time you get to your base, because here you've been a cadet for 4 years and you've been told for 4 years, just wait until you're in the real Air Force. You're not in the real Air Force yet. You're just a cadet. You're not really in the Air Force. You're just a cadet. And then finally you look down at your shoulder and you see a second lieutenant rank, and you're like, holy crap, I'm an officer in the Air Force. This is insane. After 4 years of being told that I'm not in the Air Force, now I really am in the Air Force. And I think for me, it was really real the first time I handed my ID to the guard at Shepherd Air Force Base, and he saluted me when I went through the gate. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is it. This is the start of all of the things that I've been working for the last 4 years. Like I finally made it. So that was a really surreal experience for me. I'm sure it is for everybody. And then your first week at your new base is just kind of a who's who of all the different squadrons for support. You get the finance, all that taken care of. You talk to the TMO people, you talk to the medical people, you talk to the dental people, and then you start talking about your scheduling for your class date. It could be as soon as you're starting pilot training next week. Congrats, you have like 4 days off, or you're going to be sitting around for 9 months. You're just going to be a casual for a while. And that just kind of depends on AFPC, whatever, they send down, whatever the gods of Air Force PC see fit to give you, that's what you get. So be ready for anything, because you could get there and they could tell you have 9 months, and then somebody drops out in the very next class and they throw you in. And so when you get to your first pilot training base, everybody has to be ready for it. That was my experience there. And then for those that don't have PPLs, personal pilot's license, they go to a program called IFT, which I went to. I didn't have a PPL. That lasts about a month and a half. It's about 6 weeks long. And that is in Pueblo, Colorado. And essentially, it's changed a little bit. It used to be called Intro to Flight Screening, I think is what they called it. And it was designed to be kind of a washout program to kind of identify the people that didn't really have what it took to be a pilot and wash them out. That has since changed, I think probably as a result of the pilot shortage in the Air Force. And now it's more of just like an introductory course. It's still possible to fail out of it, and people do, but it's much less common. In my flight of like 35 people, I think we had one single dropout. So it's mostly just an opportunity to learn how to fly in the Air Force way, because if you have any civilian flying experience, it's incredibly different to the way we fly in the Air Force. And in a much better way, it's kind of like UPT light. You do all the same things that you do in UPT with, like, people hear about the stand-ups, like the emergency procedure stand-ups, the boldface, all that stuff that UPT is kind of notorious for. You get kind of like an introduction with it in IFT. And so that's why, civilian flying is awesome, and if you have a PPL, then that's great, and that's a good experience. But I think if you're kind of on the fence about getting a PPL prior to commissioning, my advice would actually be to not get it, because I think having that experience of going to IFT and having that kind of UPT light sets you ahead of the guys who just have a PPL and a couple hundred hours of flying experience. Other people may have different experiences that had PPLs. I didn't, but I thought that IFT was a really, really good preparation for UPT. So like I said, that's about 6 weeks down in DOS Aviation in Pueblo, Colorado. It's a good time. You live for the soft serve ice cream, and you work hard and learn how to fly planes. It's the first time the Air Force is paying you to fly planes. So
Man, you have it figured out. Soft serve ice cream makes everything.
You got to live for the little things, man. You got to live for the little things. There was one day where it was out, and, man, it was like a dark cloud was just hanging over the building. Everyone was pissed off.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But it's a good time. It's hard. It's really hard. You're working long days and you're stressed out, but it is the first time that you're flying a plane for the Air Force. And so if your dream has been like to be an Air Force pilot ever since you were a little kid, it kind of feels real at that point for the very first time. So that's really cool. And then you come back from IFT feeling, ready ready to conquer the world, and then you start UPT, and it puts you right back in your place, right back into our community. We say it forces you to eat the humble pie. I don't know how widespread that is in the Air Force, but man, they open your mouth and they shovel it in on those first couple of weeks. You start out in academics. You do about 8 weeks of academics, just learning everything there is possibly to know about aerodynamics and about weather and about the T6 itself. You learn the systems inside and out, and you take a bunch of tests, and then you start flying, and it doesn't let up for a long time after that. You're just going hard, 12-hour days, sometimes 6 days a week, and I mean, it's hard, but ultimately, as long as you don't lose sight of your goal, it's totally worth it at the end of the day. It was an awesome experience. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, but it was totally worth it. It's easy to say that in retrospect, but I actually managed to enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, good. Let's pull on that thread a little bit. Let's kind of work our way through UPT with the strong caveat that things do change.
Yep.
That the syllabus for UPT is not a static thing, that it's
For
living,
sure.
breathing,
Yep.
and that your experience is going to obviously differ from those that have gone before or will go later in the future.
Yep, and especially recently, it's been changing a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so let's kind of walk through the timeline, the structure, things that you can expect to get involved with, and you're able to do this talking from your perspective to somebody who literally has no idea what UPT is like, because I have no idea what UPT is like.
Yeah, so I'll talk kind of like broad what the program looks like over 55 weeks, and then maybe I'll just take a day and say, like, what does an average day in UPT look like? So broad strokes, you start out and it's all academics. Like I said, you're learning everything there is to know under the moon about how to fly an airplane. Anything that could possibly affect flying an airplane, flight plans, weather, aerodynamics, everything. You're getting tested on it, and you're getting academics on it. And for that, you just got to be a sponge. You just got to suck it up. Unless you were an aerospace engineer or a meteorologist in college, most of it's probably going to be really new to you. And that's totally expected. They don't expect you to have any prior knowledge on any of the stuff that they're teaching you.
Yeah. Now, when you say academics, I am literally picturing being in a college classroom with, a Professor Want up at the front, just lecturing me on a topic, and my eyes are glazing over and I'm ready to pass out.
A depressing amount of the time, that's actually pretty much shacked. I mean, it depends on what you're studying, but we use the phrase a lot, death by PowerPoint. That's probably, outside the pilot community as well. Academics were death by PowerPoint, because every time you went in for class, there'd be, one whatever PowerPoint, and then there'd be this little bar at the bottom that we called the pain meter that would get a little bit taken off every slide that they went through, and it would be like 1 of 742, and then 2 of 700, and then the pain meter would slowly progress. I mean, yeah, it's pretty agonizing. I'm not going to lie to you, but it's also like it's finally something where that it's all going to be making you successful at your job. And so for me anyway, that's what kept me motivated. Like going through BYU, I was studying Arabic. I had buddies that were political science, whatever. We knew, since we wanted to be pilots, that wasn't really going to be like a factor with ultimately what we were going to be doing. So all those classes that we took in college, they were important because we needed to get our degree, but they weren't really going to affect what we were actually doing. So what I loved about the academics in UPT was it was finally classes that were directly relating to what I was going to be doing for, at least the near future for my career. So that's kind of what kept me going. When it was, the 8th hour of a 12-hour day of academics, and, whatever civilian so-and-so who has like 3 PhDs in weather, but a voice that just drones on in the same decibel level for 3 hours has been going on and on and on. That's what has to keep you going. That and a lot of caffeine. Those two things keep you going, because it's a lot. I mean, it's monotonous, and it's pretty mind numbing, but you get through it, and it's all useful stuff. Like talking about the syllabus changing a lot, there's there's nothing in the syllabus right now that has not been evaluated from 1,000 different angles to judge its usefulness. So you can at least be confident that no matter what you're learning, it really is something that's going to help you be a successful pilot, because the Air Force has taken such an interest in really streamlining UPT and only including the things that are absolutely necessary. The things that you're learning really are absolutely necessary. So, you get through that part, and then it really starts picking up once you start doing sims, because at that point it goes from being just academics to being a little bit more hands-on. So you've been learning about this airplane, you've been learning about its systems, you've been learning about, the switches and the buttons and what everything does. And then you go in for your first sim, and for the first time, you're actually turning those switches, and you're turning stuff on and turning stuff off. And the sims progress for probably about a month or two before you actually start flying. And they're what really prepare you for that first time that you fly. Because the feeling obviously isn't the same, but if you've done something 1,000 times in the sim, chances are you can do it pretty well in the airplane when you actually get there. So I remember when I had my first flight, up until the actual point that we took off, I remember vividly thinking, like, this is exactly like the simulator. Like, everything works exactly like it did when I, did it over the last 2 months 1 million times inside the simulator. Yeah. So that was a big help to me. I think that syllabus is really well designed. It definitely helped me a lot. And then you get to that point where you have your first flight, and it's a big deal. Like, they tell you about a week in advance when your first flight is going to be, and yeah, you just get really pumped for it. So the first flight in UPT is called your dollar ride, which is kind of a throwback to like the pre-World War II barnstorming era, when you'd pay the pilot $1 and he'd take you up in his airplane for a ride. And the idea is, like, when it's your very first time, essentially it's your instructor just flying you around. You're like paying him $1 to have him go fly you around, because you don't know what the hell you're doing at that point. In my case, I'd like barely ever touched an airplane before that point. So you kind of design $1 and you draw some fun things on it, or include some like memes or stuff on it, and you give it to your instructor at the conclusion of the dollar ride. And then at that point, it's pretty much just like balls to the walls for the next couple of months, because you're still doing academics, you're still learning about all those things that you started learning about, weather and aerodynamics, all that stuff, and you're simming and you're flying all at the same time. And that for me was probably the most overwhelming time in UPT, just because it felt like there were so many things that you had to know. You were flying contact, so you needed to know all the numbers for like aerobatics and stuff. And then you're simming instruments, so you need to know all the rules for instruments and how to fly an instrument approach, and all the tons of different manuals and AFIs that they have that relate to that. And then you're doing academics on formation, so you're going to have an academic test on formation next week. Then if you don't get an 85 on that, it's, you get kicked out. So it's all that stuff kind of coming into just overwhelm you. And the way you get through that is to just concentrate on whatever's next. So if you have a formation test next week and instrument sim tomorrow, but you're flying contact today, and you don't really know a lot about instruments and you don't really know anything about formation, and you're also pretty hazy on the contact numbers, learn the contact numbers, because that's what you're doing today. That's the next thing that you're doing. And that's how you keep from getting overwhelmed in UPT. You just concentrate on the next thing. We always used to say, what's the closest alligator? UPT is just sitting in a pond surrounded by alligators, and they're coming at you one by one trying to eat you. And you just got to figure out what the closest one is, because if you start thinking about all the alligators that are in there with you and on the shore, you're just going to get totally overwhelmed, because you can't handle them all at the same time. But if you just concentrate on which one is the closest, okay, I've got a flight tomorrow morning and I'm a little hazy on it. Yeah, I'm a little hazy on everything that I'm doing for the rest of the week too, but I'm most hazy on what I'm doing on the flight tomorrow. I'm going to buckle down and learn that, and then I'll figure everything else out when it comes. That's how you keep from getting overwhelmed. So you do that for probably 2 or 3 months, and then academics end. So then it's just simming and flying. So then it gets a little bit easier, and then simming ends, and then you're just flying, and then it gets quite a bit easier. Then you start taking weekends off and not really spending like every second studying anymore, ending up with you finish with T6s, and at UPT bases you track, so you go to either T38s, which is the jet trainer, T1s, which is the heavy trainer, or Hueys, which is the helicopter trainer, and then it's essentially right back to the beginning, right back to academics, sims, and flying, and it's right back to balls to the walls. So you shift airplanes, and then, I mean, it's everything that I just said about, the T6 phase could be applied in equal measure to the follow-on phase, regardless of whether you're T38s or T1s or Hueys. It's really front-loaded with academics and sims and flying, and then the academics slacking off, and then the sims slacking off, and then you're just flying, and then all that leads up to drop night. And drop night kind of feels like the pinnacle of everything that you've worked on, certainly for the last, 10, 11 months. And for a lot of guys, I know for me, it felt like the pinnacle of everything that I'd worked on for the last 6 years, because the whole time I was in ROTC, all I'd wanted to do was fly. So that's a pretty crazy night. I mean, if you want to see what a sweet drop night is, get on YouTube and type in NJEP drop night. You can find a million videos. They are rowdy and they are a lot of fun. It's kind of like, it's insane. It's just like one big party, and everybody is there just waiting to find out what they're going to fly for the rest of their careers. And I think it's a really happy night for some people, and it's a really sad night for other people. So, you're there to party with your bros that got what they wanted, and you're there to, lean on the dudes that maybe didn't get what they wanted and help them out and drink with them and be there for them if they need you to be. And after that, 2 weeks later is graduation, and then you're off to the airframe. So that's kind of broad stroke UPT. If you limit it down to one day, let's just say like an average day in the middle of UPT, there will be a set time that everyone has to be there that will be sent out on the schedule. So everyone has to arrive by a certain time. Typically, you're going to get there 15 or 30 minutes prior to that. You can't get there too far before that because there's a 12-hour duty day that you have to abide by. You won't be technically able to fly in UPT if you stay at work for more than 12 hours. So you can't get there too far before the prescribed time. And there will be a stand-up in the morning, a formal brief in the morning, and a stand-up. So everybody is sitting around a table, and one person will go up and do the formal brief. He'll brief the weather, the flying conditions, the NOTAMs. He'll just kind of give an overview of the flying picture for that day. And then there will be a stand-up. So the instructor will get up in front of everybody and give whoever chosen at random an emergency procedure. And you'll have to stand up and you'll have to walk through the emergency procedure with the instructor in front of you, asking you questions, firing you off, trivia or whatever it might be.
Warrior knowledge.
Yeah, honestly, yeah, it's a lot like warrior knowledge. Yep. Systems, for example, if you have a fire in flight, what are going to be your immediate actions? You've got to be able to just spit them right out. And then, okay, so now that you've done those things, now what are you going to do? What's going to be your ultimate game plan? And that is stressful, but you get used to it because, you do it every morning. And that definitely is one of the emphasis items because they want you to be safe, but it also, I think, pays dividends if you actually do experience something like that in flight, because then you can just think about the thousands of stand-ups that you've had and you know exactly what to do. So that's why they do it. So you have your stand-up. If your flying morning goes, that could be anywhere from 6 to 7 to 8 in the morning. And then after that, the people that are flying in the morning will immediately start getting ready for their flight. So if you're flying in the morning, typically your brief will be anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour after that first stand-up. So you'll immediately go and start just getting materials ready for your flight. If you're flying something like instruments, typically you'll start reviewing the numbers, you'll review the procedures. If you're flying contact, you'll look at the aerobatic numbers, that kind of thing. If you're flying formation, you'll do a lot of chair flying. So you'll sit down and you'll close your eyes and you'll just visualize what the flight is going to look like. Where am I going to put my hands? What radio calls am I going to make? Where is my airplane going to be in space in relation to this other airplane? And that all leads up to the flight brief, which is typically around 3 hours prior to your actual takeoff. You have a brief with the instructor that you're going to fly with, and he essentially walks through the flight with you. He, talks over the maneuvers that you're going to do, the profile that you're going to fly. He, clarifies things. He'll ask you questions depending on the instructor. It would kind of depend on who you fly with. Some of them really loved to drill you on knowledge, and you'd kind of learn who the hammers were and who the, we called them the Santa Clauses, the guys that were great to fly with because they'd never asked you anything and they'd always pass you. So you'd kind of learn who was who the hammers were and who the Santa Clauses were. And if it was a hammer, you'd probably study a little bit extra the night before you flew. And then you go out and fly, you go out and rage. And depending on the kind of flight, there's more raging and less raging, depending on what your profile is. If you're just flying instruments, It's definitely in the less raging category because typically you're just learning how to fly safely in the weather. So you'll be in the back seat rather than the front seat, and they usually have like a curtain that they draw around the cockpit so you can't even see out the window, just to simulate that you're in like really, really thick weather. And so you're flying entirely off of your instruments at that point. And typically you'll plan a flight from whatever base you're stationed at to like a nearby airport, fly some instrument approaches to that runway, and then fly home. So, not too exciting, but then, if you go out for a formation flight, it can be really, really, really fun to just go out and rip the plane around in the military airspace. And all the time in the back of your mind, there's the knowledge that there's an instructor in the plane with you, and everything you're doing is being evaluated by him. And I would say of everything, that's probably the thing in UPT that is the most stressful, is from the second you start that brief in the morning to the second you get out to the jet to the second you finish, you are being watched. And not only watched, but you are being compared to your peers. And everything you're doing is being compared to everything that they're doing, and you're not in the cockpit with them. So you don't know if maybe that screw up you just made is the same one he made, or maybe you're the only one making it. And that's something that is really stressful. And I think the way you get around that is just by remembering that, you just need to be the best pilot you can be and not stress about how anybody else in your class is doing.
Yeah, it just goes back to what we were talking about before, about controlling those things that you have 100% control over, and not worrying about so much about the other details.
You can't control how anybody else in your class does. You can only be the best pilot you can be. So you do that flight, and the flights will typically last between an hour and 2 hours typically, and then you come back, and then there's always an exhaustive debrief where they will nitpick every little piece of the flight, and they have the ability to bring up on their computer literally like the tapes of the flight. So they can bring up footage of the flight from inside your cockpit and say like, well, what were you thinking here? Like, why did you do that? And it sucks because you're like, usually you know exactly what you did and it's coming, and you're like, oh man, they're probably going to bring this thing up, and then they bring it up and you're like, oh man, I was hoping they wouldn't notice that, but they did because they always do. But it's good. It's a learning experience. I mean, that's how you become a better pilot. You screw things up, and you tell your buddies what you screwed up, and then you all learn together, and you become better in the process. The debrief is probably what I would say is the most important part of UPT is learning from that debrief, because that's what you take into the next flight. The mistakes that you made, the screw-ups that you had, if you make sure that they're confined to that flight, then that's how you become a better pilot. So it's by really paying attention and really internalizing what your instructors are saying in that debrief that I think you learn the most in UPT. And then after the debrief, you could have a class, you could have a sim, or you could just be looking for tomorrow and seeing what do I have to study. And then typically you're confined by whatever that 12 hours is. You're going to be there until you hit that 12-hour point. Then you're going to go home. You're going to relax for like 15 or 20 minutes, chill out, maybe play some video games or run to the gym, whatever you can do to unwind, make yourself dinner, and then right back at it, study for a few hours before bed, and then go to sleep and then wake up. And it's the same thing the next morning. And it's a tough 55 weeks. It's definitely not easy. But like I said at the beginning, you just always have to have at the front of your mind the goal, what you're working towards. And if you do that, you can make it through it. If you always, like everybody in my flight, what we did as like motivation is we all bought wings, the wings that you get pinned on when you graduate from UPT. And we all kept those in our room. And just take a second each day, look at those wings, and just remember why you're doing it, because it's really hard. And it can be tough to remember that at times. But just keep that at the front of your mind, and you'll end up being okay.
Yeah, that's really good. Any other like tips and tricks that you might share with those who are hoping to go to UPT here in the near future?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the biggest one is what I mentioned before. Just concentrate on the next thing. Don't allow yourself to become overwhelmed. That is the number one thing that will help you succeed at UPT. There's so many things to worry about, so many things that you feel like you don't know. And if you got a pilot slot, you're probably used to being a pretty successful person. And you're probably pretty used to hearing something in class and being like, oh yeah, like I totally understand that, or I'm going to make sure I get that like right away because I'm the kind of person that understands things easily. And it was hard for me, but what I had to do was, if I heard something in class that I didn't understand, but like, for example, I had a flight right afterwards, I just had to forget about it and be like, you know what, I'll figure that out when I need to figure it out. I'm going to go fly formation right now, and that's what I need to concentrate on right now, because I have a flight in, an hour or 2 hours, and this test on this thing that I don't understand isn't for another couple of days, so I'm just not going to worry about it. So just figure out what that closest alligator is and buckle down on that. That's how you survive. That is one thing. And then the other thing I would say is do your best to excel at the things that don't necessarily involve flying. Because UPT, it's designed to make you a good pilot, and it's, that is what it is. It's going to give you the tools to do that. But above and beyond that, you will succeed if you're just a good officer and a good bro. If you're the guy that goes in and makes popcorn and makes coffee for your UPT class, if you're the guy that cleans up the flight room, if you're the guy that makes flashcards for your bros, if there's something that everybody's struggling with, that doesn't really have anything to do with flying, but ultimately it pays dividends in the long run, because it's going to help you be a better officer and help you be seen as ultimately a better officer. Because when the flight commander makes your assignments, and this is the way the process was when I went through, but the flight commander was the one that ultimately made the assignments, and his opinion of you was very, very important to that process. And so if he saw you as maybe not the best pilot, but like a pretty good bro, then that could pay huge dividends in the selection process, especially if you're a guy who maybe flying doesn't come quite as easily to you as it does for the other people in your class, because there will be dudes in your class with golden hands, and it will piss you off, because these dudes will study half as much as you and chair fly half as much as you, and they will just breeze through the flights. And that is what it is. You can't change that. That's one of those factors that you can't change, like we've been talking about. But you can 100% change how good of a bro you are and how good of a dude you are in the squadron. That's something that you have full control over, and it's something that gets noticed.
Yeah, so you haven't talked too much about the team mentality and approach to UPT. From what you've described so far, it sounds very, very individual. But there has to be a team element to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, you're the only one that's going to get your assignment. The drop that you get is for you, and you need to be cognizant of that. That being said, the mentality that you have as a flight, because it's typically divided up into flights, and so flights are going to be the basic organizational unit that you're going to work with. The dudes in your flight, you're all going to have the same instructors, you're going to be on the same schedule. Those are going to be the guys that you interact with the most. The mentality that you have with the flight and the morale that you have with the flight and the rapport that you have with each other, that is going to be huge in your success. If you guys gel really well together and get along well and help each other, that will be noticed, and it will make everyone have a much smoother experience. The instructors will notice it. The other, flights will even notice it. And that was something that, I think my flights through UPT were really, really tight, and that really, really helped me, because it meant that if I was struggling with something, and I definitely struggled with a lot of things in UPT, I had that support group that was right there, and I could go to anybody and be like, hey, so-and-so, I'm really having trouble understanding this. Could you walk through this with me? And they would do it. And especially if you're the kind of person who learns from experience rather than from reading, which is definitely me. If I read something in a book, it's hard for me to visualize it, but if I do it once, I'll be able to do it again. And so that was really what helped me get through it, is getting guys together and being like, all right, let's talk about this. Let's walk through this visually and show me how to do it for those that have already done it. So it's kind of counterintuitive, because from the outset, it seems like logically UPT is a zero-sum game. Every fighter that guy gets is a fighter that you don't get. But it doesn't feel that way when you're in it. It really feels like you're all working towards the same goal of getting wings. And there are some people that it matters a lot to, and typically those people are pretty easy to identify right at the beginning. But I can say that everybody that I knew, including me that had a really good UPT experience, just saw it as everyone is trying to get their wings. And if every single person in this flight gets their wings and doesn't wash out, then that's what we'll call a success. And everybody will get what they'll get, and everybody has their own personal goals, and that's great. It's great that everybody has goals for themselves. But as a flight, we're all helping each other to graduate. Yeah, and I think that mentality was really important for us.
Yeah, so my co-host Reed, he often talks about how the way that OTS is structured, and it sounds it's similar with UPT, is that OTS and UPT are individual events that you will fail if you try to do it alone.
Yes, 100%. Yep. And it's for all the reasons that I just said. If you're going to try to lone wolf it, you're going to miss out on all that experience that you get from comparing notes with your bros and doing it all together. So yeah, I mean, I think the worst thing that you could do at the beginning of UPT is assume that you succeed by everyone else failing, because that gets noticed, and it's not going to make you a good pilot, and it's not going to make you a good officer. And like I said, it might seem a little counterintuitive, but the people that were the most successful in UPT came from flights that all helped each other, that had that just ingrown support network. I think those were the flights that ultimately produced the best pilots and, frankly, the best officers at the end of the day. Yeah. Similar to OTS, I'm sure. And field training was the same way in our OTC.
Yeah, and it's one of those principles that is applicable across the Air Force experience, that yes, you are being evaluated and your performance reports are for yourself, and you do all of these things by yourself, but true mission success in any context, in a training mission, in an operational mission, in anything that we do, it may be individual. You have an individual role that you have to perform, but you will fail. The mission will fail if you try to do it by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And I think that's a really good way to look at OTS and pilot training. Just look at it as the mission is for everyone to graduate and get their wings. You have individual goals of what you want to accomplish with the airframe that you're going to get, but ultimately you succeed and fail by everyone graduating from UPT and getting those wings pinned on their chests, because people will struggle. Some people will struggle more than others, but ultimately when people struggle, everyone benefits when you band together and help them out, not just them. Your whole flight benefits.
Yeah. I'm kind of catching that theme throughout our whole discussion here, is that there's this brotherhood, and we want to include our sisters too, right? That there are some really fantastic female pilots out there, and they are definitely part of this as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's all about banding together with these other officers and cadets in the context of ROTC, the Academy, and OTS, but coming together as that team to make sure that each individual is ultimately successful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the most important thing to remember for anybody that wants to be a part of the Air Force as a pilot or as a logistics officer or as a lawyer. It's being part of something bigger than yourself that has a goal bigger than yourself. And I think that's really cool. I mean, I think that's one of the most meaningful things that I've found as an Air Force officer that is not exclusive to pilots, that you're part of an organization that has a mission that's much, much bigger than you. And that can be frustrating sometimes, because it means that your individual needs are not always the priority of the Air Force, but it can also be very, very rewarding, because when you see that mission get accomplished, you know that you're a part of it, and also that giant organization that you're a part of is also a support network for you, that it is, insofar as you are doing your job to help it accomplish its mission, it will also come back and support you and help you get through tough times or whatever you might be going through. And that's true regardless of what your job is, of being part of that larger than life organization that has that big mission that you contribute to.
Yeah. Love it. Such a good discussion, such an important topic, UPT in general, but also that final part of it, the team dynamic, team mentality of not being the Blue Falcon, there at
Blue
UPT.
Falcon, yeah. Oh yeah. In field training, UPT, OTS, SOS, it's all the same at the end of the day. Just being a good dude, helping your buddies out, because that's the goal at the end of the day. Just making sure everybody gets through it.
Awesome. Well, good. I really appreciate you taking the time to shed some light on UPT and
yeah, for sure,
and helping our audience better understand how it all works. I'm sure that this is a topic that they're going to be very interested in. Have just been waiting for us to finally make available to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Just happy to share my experience.
Well, good. Let's shift gears just for a little bit and talk about your approach to developing yourself as an officer. we've heard a lot about your experience going through ROTC and UPT, but what about you putting the wings aside, you just being the bar wearing lieutenant? Now that ROTC and UPT and all that stuff is over, how do you continue to develop yourself as an officer?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, since it's a little bit tougher to answer that question because I'm not in a leadership position. So for me, when I was thinking about that exact same question, it came down to learning how to be the most lethal pilot that I possibly can be, because that's what I'm training for. That's what I've signed up to do. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'd have to say for myself, just because I haven't had a lot of leadership experience since putting the bars on my shoulder.
You haven't had a lot of traditional leadership experience.
Absolutely.
You've had lots of leadership experience, pure leadership being, first and foremost among them, going through ROTC and UPT with your peers. But yeah, you haven't had the traditional leadership that we've talked about already.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that as a flyer, sometimes that non-traditional leadership does show up, and you have to be aware of it. And I think a really good example of that is like our enlisted crew chiefs that launch our planes every single day and load our bullets. There's always two of them that are out there when we go out to the jets that strap us in and set everything up for us. And I mean, the impression that we give to them is the impression that they carry back to all the other enlisted people that they interact with in their day-to-day lives. And so I think, having always a really good attitude to them and not trying to look like big shot, like I don't have to talk to you, I'm the pilot, but always being very open and very, I guess, welcoming to them is at least in my position the best way that I've found to be a leader, even though I'm not in a leadership position, to still give them, I guess, something to look up to as an officer, rather than just, an aloof, cold-eyed pilot that's just going to wave them off once they've done their job and go and fly. That's something that's been a big emphasis item in my squadron, and something that, I could always do better. But, a small way that even in the ops world you can lead.
No, I like it. Have there been any sort of books or podcasts, any sort of like courses or anything outside of the Air Force that you have pursued that has helped to grow your officership and your leadership?
Yeah, for sure. I love reading. I love podcasts. On the podcast side, I'm more of a news guy. I really like current events podcasts. I listen to one from the New York Times and one from ABC News. I think that's really important as an Air Force officer to stay up to date on what's going on in the world. I think that'll make you a better officer ultimately. In terms of leadership, I think my favorite book that I read recently is a biography of Lincoln called Team of Rivals. Absolutely phenomenal book. And I think, I would make it required reading for any leader because of the example that it shows of somebody that took people from every different walk of life and people with very, very different opinions on how to solve a problem and essentially made them all work together. Because that's what the Air Force is. There are people that are liberal, there are people that are conservative, there are people that are religious, there are people that are atheists, but they all got to do the same mission, and the mission has to be done. And so if you want to be an effective leader in the Air Force, you have to learn how to take those people with different opinions and use them to accomplish that mission and help them set those differences aside and concentrate on the things that unite them. And Lincoln was an incredible example of that. And this book, Team of Rivals, really focuses on how he was able to do that. I just threw it off the top of my head because I just recently finished it. But that's probably one of the ones that had the biggest impact on me in terms of how to be an effective leader and how to get things done. I absolutely loved that one. Yeah.
We're big fans of professional reading on this podcast. We highly recommend that people make it a practice. It's one of the most effective ways that you can continue to develop yourself as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do a lot of reading just on current events and international politics. That's what I majored in essentially when I was at BYU. And so I have a lot of recommendations on that as well. I read about leadership when I can, but my focus is usually on international events and that kind of thing. So I've got plenty of recommendations there too, if anybody wants to hear them. Because again, I think that also helps you become a better, more well-rounded officer just by knowing more about the world around you and knowing, For example, tomorrow, if we get sent to North Korea, well, what is the situation in North Korea? What is their political situation like? What's their leader like? Why would we get sent there? What are some reasons that we would get sent there? Or Syria, we pulled our troops out of Syria. What does that mean for the region? What does that mean for our allies? What does that mean for the political stability? I think as an officer, it's really important to know those things as well.
Absolutely. Once again, you are part of this team that's trying to achieve this broader mission called the National Defense Strategy, and you need to understand your role in helping to accomplish it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is why it's so important to stay up to date on those things, because ultimately, whatever your little contribution is, your job is just a piece of that giant mission. And only by understanding the world and what the Air Force is trying to do can you understand how you contribute to that, how your job contributes to that.
Yeah, awesome. So understanding what you've gone through up to this point and your process of developing yourself, what would you tell Cadet Curriden, way back 9 years ago when you first stepped in the door to ROTC? What would you tell yourself?
I think I would say it's worth it. It's totally worth it. You'll go through some really hard times, a lot of early mornings, a lot of late nights, a lot of hard work. But the things that I've done and the things that I've seen since that very first day in 2011, walking through the doors as a little AS-100, have been totally worth it. Worth every second that I spent working towards it. I think that's probably the most important thing that I would say, and I'd say that to anybody that wanted to be an Air Force officer.
Yeah,
it's worth it in the end.
It is worth it, and yeah, it's hard.
Yeah,
but it's so worth it.
It's really hard, and sometimes there's just moments that you've got to live for. Sometimes you could have 5 bad days, and if you have one amazing day, you just got to live for that, and it's worth it for that day.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, 2 more questions for you. First of all,
sure.
If there's somebody who's interested in picking your brain on UPT or anything that you've brought up in this podcast, how do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. So most easy would probably just be via email. My email is morgancurriden@gmail.com. And I'm more than happy to answer questions about getting into UPT, getting into NJEPT, flying fighters, how to succeed in UPT, flying the F-15, any questions about that, I'm happy to answer. Like I said, I'm pretty fresh out of UPT, pretty fresh into the combat Air Force, so it's all hopefully still pretty close to the surface.
Cool. Awesome. I believe you're part of our Facebook group.
Yes.
And so you can also be reached there.
Yep. Feel free that way as well.
Got to put that plug in there. You want people to come join the Facebook group and join in the discussion that happens off the podcast.
Yeah.
Where we continue to help
Absolutely.
each other develop and grow as officers in the Air Force.
Yeah. No, absolutely. More than happy to answer questions about that. And, like I said, I personally would throw in a plug and say being a pilot is the greatest thing in the whole world, greatest thing you could possibly do. But I have a lot of friends that do a lot of different things in the Air Force, and they all find their careers incredibly fulfilling, and they all love what they do.
Awesome. So my final question, what does it mean to be an officer?
Whew, man, that's a big one. I think, to me, maybe I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning about Colonel Kacharik, the commander when I first got to BYU Air Force ROTC. I think it means to be above reproach. And that's something that I don't claim to be a perfect example of, and I think most officers would probably say they're not great examples of it, but I think that has to be the aspiration. That has to be the goal of every officer, to say in every aspect of your life, you have to be above reproach. And that's, I could 100% say that about Colonel Kacharik in my first assignment, that just whether it was academics or fitness or his personal life, like I just knew that he had it all figured out. And so as a result, I respected him and I wanted to follow him. Yeah. So, like I said, I wouldn't say that because I think I'm an example of that at all, but it's definitely what I aspire to be.
Yeah. And that aspiration that we as officers are pointed toward is what lends us the credibility and that foundation of trust that we've highlighted in this, in this episode.
Absolutely. 100%. That's what gives you the ability to lead people, and it's going to be what makes them want to follow.
I love it. Well, I would call you by your call sign, but you don't have one yet.
You can just call me Bravo in the meantime.
I don't know that it works that way, but if you can self-assign, I'll support.
I wish. That
Bravo.
would be great. That's how you avoid getting stupid call signs.
Well, Bravo, Morgan, we appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on and letting me pontificate for a little bit.
So what do you think, Reed? Did the interview with Morgan make you just want to leave Intel and just go be in UPT?
Yeah, it did. Sorry. I don't know. When I hear people talk about UPT and the training, I'm a glutton for punishment. That just sounds awesome. That sounds like so much fun. I've traditionally done well in training environments. I could totally do that. Sorry. I'm not saying I could totally be a pilot and do their job, right? But as he's describing it, my heart rate goes up a little bit. I'm like, yeah.
You start salivating a little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah. But I'm an old man. That ship has sailed and I'm all right with it. So, but
has it
yes,
though? I mean,
it totally has. Yeah. Yeah. Colin, I have a teenager. Like, it's a little late to kind of start there.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you got out of Morgan's interview?
A couple things I really liked, and we'll kind of knock these out quickly. I love his description of UPT is like being in a lake and alligators are coming to eat you, and you can't worry about all of them. So you just worry with the one that's coming right now. I use that description to talk about OTS. And I told that to my students, especially those that look clearly overwhelmed. I would sit them down and have that counseling session. Like, look, there's 100 gators coming and you can't worry about all of them. You got to take care of the one closest to the boat. I love that description. I think that's totally appropriate and something for our audience to keep in mind as they start their training experience.
Yeah, absolutely. My one caveat on that, and this kind of goes back to the discussion we've had previously about prioritization and time management, is that while it is necessary for you to focus on the thing that is both urgent and important, you cannot neglect the things that are important but not urgent.
Yeah, totally agree. I absolutely totally buy into that. But in a concentrated type event, it seems like everything is urgent and important.
It's true.
And my experience is definitely colored by OTS, which is kind of my next thing I wanted to talk about. He mentioned how they're always being evaluated while they're at UPT. And that just felt exactly like OTS to me. From the second you show up on campus until you raise your hand and throw your flight cap in the air at the end, you're being evaluated. And our assessment of who you are, your ranking in the class, your ranking in the flight is all being constructed every minute we're with you. So I felt like OTS seemed like a very good approximation of the kind of experience they're going to have at UPT. That's what I thought. When he described UPT, I'm like, man, that sounds like OTS.
Yeah. And that's kind of an extension of the discussion that we were having last week about Slider's interview and the idea that Air Force ROTC does not prepare our pilots very well for UPT. Maybe the OTS way of doing things is the better way, the broader solution for commissioning officers. Not that there's really anything wrong with the way that the academy trains or the ROTC trains and prepares our officers, but maybe OTS is the better approximation, as you put it, better preparation for the things that are going to come next.
It's so hard to know. Yeah, it's tough. I just felt like the concentrated nature of the training and the forced prioritization, the just hyper concentrated nature. I think that's what I felt. And then that combined with the complete umbrella of constant evaluation just seemed very similar to the OTS experience. So, those are some of the things I was thinking about.
My take on the flying training environment, the UPT environment, was not so much that it looked like OTS or felt like OTS. Obviously, I've never been to OTS, so I don't really have that type of context. But what I do have is the university environment. And I feel like UPT is just an extension of that type of context where you're in the academic classroom listening to lectures, you've got tests that you have to prepare for, all the while life is happening around you and you have to balance it.
Yeah, I think, again, we're both looking at it through our own lenses because I thought college was awesome.
Well, I didn't say that college is not awesome.
See, and that's where, I mean, I thought the UPT sounded like a whole lot of awesome that you wouldn't want to do again. Like, I could totally go back to college today. If you said, hey, we're going to keep paying you, you just need to go to school indefinitely, man, sign me up. I am there.
Well, it's a good thing you're in the Air Force because that's kind of how it's set up.
Yeah, but if you said, hey, we're going to pay you just to go to OTS, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not really sure. You know, rewarding experience and all, but I'm not exactly sure that's what I want to do every day. That's kind of what I'm.
That is also what happened to you twice.
Yes, it did.
And we've already heard your experience about going back the second time.
Yep. Now I'm the jailer. Yeah. I have one last thing that I do want to talk about that Lieutenant Curriden brought up, and it definitely made me say, you know, I need to repent. So here is my confession, Colin. I loved how he said, when speaking of, you know, what should they expect of officers? And he said, how about we ask them? That wasn't my first answer, and it should be. And so I'm recommitting to the Air Force and to you, Colin, that I'm going to be better about asking that kind of question. That is something I want to be my first answer. Not that I know better and that I can tell the enlisted what they should feel or how they should act or what they should believe. I should ask them, and I should use that as a starting point instead of just deciding. So that's my confession and my penance, Colin. I'm going to commit now to be better about that. It's something that I've believed and ascribed to in the past, and I don't know where I went wrong, but I want to get back on that track.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that with us, Reed. And along those same lines, I'm seeing a recurring theme out of some of the interviews. Like you said, Morgan brought it up here about asking your people about what they need or what they expect from you. Same thing came out of CJ's interview about the first two questions that you should ask. The first one is, what could I have done better? But asking it of yourself. The second question is, what could I have done better? But asking it to your people. And I agree with you. I'm along those same lines. I need to be better about asking what it is that those that I lead or have responsibility for need of me or expect of me. And just to preview the episode coming out next week, we are going to release an interview with Chief Master Sergeant Jermaine Evans, who is the command chief at the Home Center. He is the senior enlisted advisor to Brigadier General Nimai, the Home Center commander, and we'll hear from him his perspective on why officers exist, what his recommendation is to those who are officers or want to be one. Ultimately, what is it that the enlisted need and expect from us, the officers in the Air Force?
Man, I'm really looking forward to that.
It's going to be awesome. Well, it's been such a great thing talking with each of these pilots over the last few weeks. One thing that's common between all of them, not only that they are pilots, but something that we should highlight here is the fact that each one of them was selected for NJIPT, the Euro-NATO Joint Jet Pilot Training Program.
Yeah, and we kind of got into it a little bit. You know, each of them barely addressed it, but I think it's worth mentioning. NJIPT selection's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, getting selected to be a pilot is already a cut. Well, let's even walk that back. Being given the opportunity to commission in the United States Air Force, you're making a cut. Then being given an opportunity to make the cut to be a pilot, you're making another cut. To get NJEP, I mean, that is like the last cut pretty much at this stage in their career. There are going to be other opportunities to go to weapons school, to be instructor pilots, to be evaluators, you know, maybe demonstration team pilots, that kind of thing. But when it comes to like the early gates, I mean, man, this is like the last one, and it's been, you know, 5% selection rate, maybe even lower for some of these things. I don't know what the numbers are. I know that it is not many. and really prestigious environment. They all described it a little bit, but all of our NATO partners send the best that they have, and it's guaranteed T-38, which is our fighter aircraft trainer. It's a big freaking deal.
Yeah. And that just says something about the quality of these pilots that we've been able to have on the podcast in the last few weeks. And obviously it highlights the fact that we need to get somebody on this podcast to talk about NGEP and how important it is, the role it plays in the training of NATO as a whole. But we've said it before that these are the type of people that you and I get to hang out with, that we get to work with, that are our peer group that we get to learn from and serve with. And it's such an amazing opportunity. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought this up, because part of me wants our audience to also recognize that not all pilots are NGEP grads. This is, a pretty neat experience to talk to a select group of folks. I'm trying to think of, people I've served with, and there haven't been many. Now, I did have a number of students that were selected to go to NGEP when I was at officer training school, but they were some of my most successful students. I believe one was the number 2 graduate in his class. Big deal. So yeah, pretty selective program. So congrats to them. Yeah. Big thanks to Morgan, Slider, Cosmo, all these interviews that we've had over the last few weeks. We hope to have more pilots, more rated officers, obviously, but as we continue to go along in this podcast, we invite interviews from all officers, because they have made that cut. They are part of that percent that makes up our Air Force, and they all have an important, unique story to tell. Awesome. Well, thanks, Colin, for making those interviews happen, and thank you to our audience for listening to this week's episode of Commission Ed.
Thank you for listening to Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. The views and opinions of the authors expressed herein do not state or reflect those of the government and shall not be used for advertising or product endorsement purposes. Mention of any specific commercial products, process, or service by trade name, trademark, manufacturer, or otherwise does not necessarily constitute nor imply its endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the U.S. government. The mention of companies by name is solely for the purpose of discussion and should not be implied as endorsement.